Under the Olive Tree Knits. How to work the Picot Bind-Off on the Christmas cracker wrap. In this video I'm going to show you how to work the Picot Bind-Off to finish off the Christmas cracker wrap. As we work the bind-off, we're going to be creating these little picots as we go, and they just give the wrap a bit of a fancy finish. What I've done here is I've just worked a small swatch of the last lace repeat, and I've worked 4 rows of garter stitch here, but in the pattern it's just 2. To start the bind off, just knit the first 2 stitches. Then lift the first stitch on the needle over the second stitch, and that's 1 stitch bound off. Then we're going to knit the next stitch, and again lift the previous stitch over that stitch, and that's 2 stitches bound off. So as we're working the first end of the bind off, we're going to repeat those steps 3 more times. When you come to work the other end of the bind off, at this point you'll just work those steps 2 more times. There will be a video at the end just to explain that in a little bit more detail. So now we're ready to work our first picot. So what we're going to do is we're just going to slip the stitch from the right hand needle back to the left hand needle, and now using a knitted cast on we're going to cast on 3 stitches. So that's 1, 2, 3. So you've now got a cluster of 4 stitches on the left hand needle. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to knit the first 2 stitches, and then just as we did before, we're going to lift that stitch over to bind off 1 stitch, then we're going to knit the next stitch, and again lift the stitch over to bind off another stitch. And we're going to continue doing this another 7 times. So that's number 1, and here you can just see how the picot has formed there. So let's continue the bind off. Knit another stitch, so that's 2 stitches bound off, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're now ready to work the next picot, and the way you can tell that you're in the right place is that you should be working it directly into the top of the column of the decrease stitches that we made in the lace section. So you'll see these double decreases, and that stitch there should sit directly above that column of decrease stitches. So just slip that stitch back to the left hand needle, and then we're ready to work our knitted cast on. So again we're going to cast on 3 stitches. So 1, 2, 3. And there we have our cluster of 4 stitches. So now we can begin the bind off. So knit the first 2 stitches and then bind off 1 stitch, knit the next stitch and bind off 1, then continue to knit 1, bind off 1 another 7 times. So now we're ready to work the next picot, and the way you can tell you're in the right place is that the stitch on your right hand needle should sit directly above the knit one stitch that falls between the two yarn overs from the previous lace section. So just transfer that stitch back to the left hand needle, and then exactly as we did before, we're going to work a knitted cast on and cast on 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to bind off in exactly the same way that we have done previously. So 1 stitch, 2 stitch, and then work that another 7 times. So you can see here how the picot sits directly above that knit stitch that falls between the two yarn overs in the lace. So our next picot is going to fall in line with that column of decreases that we made in the lace. So the stitch on the right hand needle should follow that column all the way up. So then you can slip that back to your left hand needle and then work the knitted cast on. And from here you can just carry on working the bind off all across that final row, and if you need to sense check that you're working the picot in the right place, you can just follow those lace columns of the yarn over knit one yarn overs and the double decrease stitches, as the picot should always sit on top of those columns. And they should look something like this. So when you're down to your last stitch, just pull a loop, cut the yarn, and then pull the yarn through that loop to close. And this is how it will look when you've finished. So you can see here that those picots all sit either above a column of yarn over knit one yarn overs, or they sit above the double decreases that you made in the final lace section. So this wrap has 2 bind offs, so you've just completed the first one, and now what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to return to the provisional cast on. We're going to get those stitches back onto the needle, and then we're going to work the picot bind off for those stitches. So here I just wanted to show you what the picot bind off looks like along the provisional cast on edge. We just need to make one small change so that the picots sit in line with the columns of those yarn over and double decrease stitches from the lace section to match the picots that we made on the other end of the wrap. As I explained in the video where we picked up the stitches, we're actually working half a stitch off, so the placement of the picots is slightly different on this end than it was on the other end. So I'm just going to show you how you can read your stitches and just to make sure that you're making the picots in the correct place each time. So just as before, we're going to start by knitting 2 stitches and then binding one off, then knit the next stitch and just lift that over to bind off. When we did the first end of the wrap, we repeated these steps 3 times, but here we're just going to repeat them twice. So we're just going to do that another 2 times. So 1, 2. So this is where we're going to make our first picot point. So you can see the next stitch on the left hand needle sits right above that column of yarn over stitches that we made in the lace section. So what we're going to do is we're going to slip that stitch on the right hand needle back to the left hand needle, and then exactly as we did before, we're going to cast on 3 stitches. Then from here the bind off is worked in exactly the same way as we did before. So we cast on 3 stitches using a knitted cast on, and then we bind off 9 stitches in total between each picot. So we've bound off 9 stitches and we're now ready to work the picot that falls in line with this column of double decrease stitches. So you can see here the next stitch on the left hand needle sits directly above that column, and the stitch on the right hand needle is where we're going to start making the picot. So we're just going to slip that stitch back to the left hand needle and then work the picot as before by casting on 3 stitches. And after binding off another 9 stitches, you should find yourself here. This is where we're ready to work the next picot. You should have the column of knit 1 stitches from the lace falling right between the needles there, and this is the place where we're going to start working the next picot. So the stitch on the right hand needle just needs to come back to the left hand needle, and from here we're ready to work the next picot. So hopefully this will help you to be able to read your stitches when you're binding off on this end of the wrap, and we'll just take a look now at what that finished bind off looks like along this edge. So once you've completed the bind off along the provisional cast on edge of the wrap, this is what it will look like. So you've got your picot sitting in line with the column of yarn over knit 1 yarn over stitches, and also on top of those double decrease stitches, so they should fall in line with those columns of lace stitches. And that's how you bind off the Christmas cracker wrap.